There we go. I'm taping this because some people have asked me they want to see it later for the reasons. But the guild was like a union plus. And remember, we're talking about the Middle Ages, so there was always a spiritual content to everything. Remember, in the Middle Ages, England was a Catholic country. So a priest was usually tied to a guild. To be a member of the guild, you had to enter it. In the case of the Stonemasons Guild, most stonemasons became an apprentice about the age of 10. They would work for 7 years, and then they would be what they called a fellow craft or fellow of the craft. And that's where they would stay for many years, unless they really were good, and they would become the master of the lodge. Now, how we get the term lodge comes from this period. Remember, these were stonemasons. They were the ones who built all the great cathedrals of Europe. Notre Dame, for instance, was built by stonemasons. They also built the city walls. They built castles. Anything to be built with stone, these were the men who did it. So obviously they had to be very well educated in that profession. Now we're dealing with the Middle Ages, so when you say you lived in a town like York, you found out they were building a cathedral in Manchester. You did not commute to work. There were no cars, no trains, no planes. If you went to Manchester to work, you were going to be there all week. Maybe you might get home on the weekend, on Sunday, but in most cases, not even that. You just couldn't do it. So these guys had to have a place to eat and sleep. So the stonemasons had a lodge where they could eat and sleep. To get into that lodge, there was a guard at the gate, because not everybody could get into it. They had to verify that you deserved to be there. So there were secret signs, passwords, handshakes to get in. And depending on the sign, the password, and the handshake, the guard at the gate would know if this person was an entered apprentice or a fellow craft or a master, and would be placed in a room accordingly. Now, what happened to the Stonemasons Guild? Well, the 16th century came rolling in. England became a Protestant country, the Reformation. For the stonemasons, that was a disaster. Not because of anything against the Protestants, but Protestants don't build cathedrals. If you're a stonemason and you're looking for building a cathedral, forget about the Protestants. It ain't going to happen. So what happened? They just began losing members because there was no work. And then the second blow came. The cannon was invented. Stone walls and castles were no longer protective. Okay, another whole line of work for stonemasons out the window. So they were stuck. Technology beat them. What do? Well, what happened was, as this was going on in the 16th century, a lot of nobles, intellectuals, the movers and shakers of English society began to get interested in these stonemasons guilds. People like Sir Isaac Newton. He became a mason in the 16th century. He was an accepted mason. He was accepted as if he was a real stonemason. And this happened quite a bit. Then throughout the 16th century, as accepted masons began to come in, more and more of them came in. Suddenly, a lot of lodges had more accepted masons than real stonemasons. And lodges began to sprout up everywhere in the 16th and 17th centuries. What this meant was, and they took over lodges. Then it was basically getting to be a mess, because all these new lodges coming up had their own rituals, had their own things that they were doing. And so it was a mess. If you went from one lodge to the other, you wouldn't know the signs that they used. You wouldn't know the handshake. You wouldn't know this. You wouldn't know that. They operate in different ways. By the way, the earliest mention that we have of Freemasonry as we know it is actually in the 13th century with the Regis poem. So there was a problem. There was no central authority. So in 1717, 4 lodges met at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern. And for those who are interested, Masons like taverns. These are men, they get to eat and drink. Something I'm sure everybody here is shocked to know that men like to eat and drink. And they met at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern in London, in what is today Queen Street. And for those who are Masons who know what that address actually means, what's there, that's the Freemasons Hall in London today. They formed the premier Grand Lodge of London, of England. And in 1723, they commissioned a fellow by the name of Anderson to write the constitutions of Masonry, what it means for a lodge to operate, what are the rules, what are the regulations. And he wrote them, they were accepted, and this brought unity to all the lodges. All the lodges knew they had to follow certain rules. They were free within those rules to make certain changes that would meet their needs. But they had to follow certain basic rules. And they made the master was the 3rd degree in Masonry, and he would run the lodge. Now, in the system of Masonry, the master is an elected office. He's not appointed. He's elected by the brothers. Lodges operate on a basically democratic system. A lodge cannot spend money unless the entire lodge approves of it. Everything is like that, but the master is in charge, according to the constitutions. If you raise your hand in lodge to speak, and the master does not call on you, you're not talking. And you don't speak to the lodge, you speak to the master. Through the master, you speak to the lodge. That's the way it operates. A very famous story that illustrates this. President Theodore Roosevelt was an active Mason. And while president, he would go to his lodge. His lodge was in Oyster Bay, New York. He had something on his mind to speak. It was not political. You don't talk politics in the lodge. But it was something Masonic. He stood up, he was called on by the master, and began to talk. And true, it wasn't about politics, but he was a politician. And politicians, as we know, love to talk, and talk, and talk. 10 minutes into this, the master's gavel came down. That means in a Masonic lodge, when the master's gavel comes down, sit down, I've heard enough, shut up. It's basically the meaning. And President Theodore Roosevelt dutifully sat down. One of the brothers got highly insulted. How dare you? This is the President of the United States, and you are gaveling him down. You're a gardener. And by the way, he was. How dare you gavel down the president? President Roosevelt stood up immediately and said, I am the president, that's true. Outside the lodge. In here, I'm a brother. And he is a gardener. Outside the lodge. In here, he's the master. That shows you the power of the master, that even a president cannot overrule him. Wow. And this goes back to Anderson's constitutions. Now, in 1837, Masonry spread very rapidly around England, Scotland, and Ireland. And then it jumped over to the continent, and the Grand Orient of France got into the act. They claimed that the Knights Templars had become Masons. That's one of the unicorns. But they made this claim. Now, the Grand Orient of France, we'll get into later about its problems. But then it spread out throughout Europe. Now remember, this was 18th century England, right? The British Army was going all over the world, and the British Navy. The British Army had military lodges within each regiment. So wherever the British Army went, Masonry went with them. Wherever the British Navy went, and there were lodges on ships, the Masonry went with them. So this meant the British going around the world, Masonry got into places like India and other places that you would never suspect. And then, of course, in North America, as the British colonized North America, there were Masons who came over. The first Mason that we know of was in North America, British America, in 1688. Now, Massachusetts, now, Grand Lodges. Let me explain what a Grand Lodge is. Okay, you have lodges, and then you have Grand Lodges. A Grand Lodge controls all the lodges within a certain jurisdiction, a certain area. In the United States, there are 51 Grand Lodges, one for each state. The 51st is Washington, D.C., which does not belong to any state. So they have their own Grand Lodge. The first Grand Lodge to be, and all Grand Lodges got a charter from another Grand Lodge, and they can trace their charter back to the Grand Lodge of England. So it's now called the United Grand Lodge of England, and all lodges can trace themselves to a Grand Lodge. That's where they got their charter. And then the Grand Lodge can trace itself back to the Grand Lodge of England, or Scotland, or Ireland. Those are the three premier Grand Lodges. Benjamin Franklin was a Mason in 1731. He published Anderson's Constitutions in the United States and Pennsylvania. Remember, he was a printer. In 1732, he became the senior warden of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, which was not yet recognized by the Grand Lodge of England. The first Grand Lodge in the United States to be recognized, to get a charter from the Grand Lodge of England, was the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. The first lodge of Massachusetts was St. John's Lodge, but a lot of men were forming lodges and Grand Lodges. They weren't sure if they would last. So they formed them, and once they saw it was a going concern, they got their charter. Because if you notice, Benjamin Franklin published this stuff before Masonry was organized in the United States. By the 1780s, all the British colonies had Grand Lodges. New York got its charter, by the way, in 1783. Although we did have two Grand Masters before 1783. They had to leave New York, by the way, because during the Revolution they were Tories, which meant they supported the British in the American Revolution, which meant, if you know anything about the period, somebody who openly aided and abetted the British to a high degree during the Revolution was advised to go to Canada. To the places that we've been, a lot of them got settled by Americans who took the wrong side of the Revolution. But Masons being Masons, when they had to leave, they didn't just say, get out of here. They had a party. They said, too bad you have to leave, we love you, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. The Grand Master of New York in 1783, from 1783 to 1801, was a fellow named Robert R. Livingston, who was Chancellor of the State of New York. And he's a very important person in American history. I'll get more into one of the things that he did Masonically and in the United States, and politically, so to speak, in American history. This issue about politics and Masonry, no Grand Lodge or Lodge will ever support somebody running for office, period. We don't do that. We don't take sides in politics. And if you speak about politics in the lodge, when I was master, I was asked, what would you do? This is very simple. I'd give them one warning. If they continued, they would be escorted out. We do not take that lightly. We have men of different political beliefs within our lodges, different religious beliefs. These are subjects we leave for the individual. I have brothers I've known for over 20 years. I could not tell you how they voted at all. It never comes up. But one of the most important Masons in American history was President George Washington. He was initiated in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1752. And in 1753, he became a Master Mason. He was raised to the degree of Master Mason, the third degree. He was an active Mason throughout his entire life. During the American Revolution, when he was Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, he actually attended meetings. Shows you how important this was to him as an individual. Most of his staff were Masons. He felt he could trust them, that they had made an obligation to be trusted, and he could trust who they were. As a side note, it's quite true. You've all heard of the Boston Tea Party, right? What were those guys doing that night? The Sons of Liberty were meeting in a tavern owned by St. John's Lodge. Most of the Sons of Liberty happened to be Masons. So, and they were at collation, where there was a lot of food and especially a lot of liquid being passed around. And they were discussing this tea tax and how much they hated it. And then you know the rest of the story. They left there and went to Boston Harbor. By the way, the royal governor was also a Mason and knew all these guys. So it wasn't like they were, even though they were disguised as American Indians, it didn't fool him. Because he knew who they were. They're all brothers. But that's a little interesting sidelight to, now you might ask women, if you don't get involved in politics, how do you explain that? Remember, within Masonry, we believe in the concept that a man's politics is his private matter, but the government has no right to enter into that realm. There's a limit to the government. The government cannot get through those doors. You put a bunch of guys together who have this fundamental belief, give them some drink, etc., on things that they agree with, you're going to have some certain ideas expressed back and forth, which will then lead itself to other things. That's why Masons have been, even though within the lodge we don't talk politics, there have been very famous Masons who have been political, who've been presidents. 14 presidents were actually Masons, and they were active Masons. But if you ask them what they did in lodge, unless you were a brother Mason, they wouldn't tell you. And then they would not talk about their politics in lodge. That was not the place for it. Now, George Washington, as being an active Mason, when he was elected president, you have to remember, he was extremely popular. He was probably the most popular man in America. At the Constitutional Convention, he was the leader of the Constitutional Convention, and it was his presence that really got everything going. They didn't want a lot of those delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and it was not exactly a peaceful event. They were arguing back and forth, men of different ideas, different beliefs, politically, different philosophies. There were many issues that could have split them apart, but they would all look at Washington and say, I don't want to disappoint that man. That was the power of Washington's presence. So like a lot of issues that would tear a lot of people apart, he unified them. And so it's obvious that they would choose him as president. He got a unanimous vote in the Electoral College twice. The only man ever to receive that honor. There was one other president, President Monroe, that he almost got a unanimous vote. There was one delegate to the Electoral College who said, no, you're no Washington. You might be good, but you're not there. So when Washington was elected president, remember New York City was the first capital of the United States. So Washington was going to be inaugurated. If you look at the Constitution, it has the oath of office that every president says, minus 4 words. The 4 words not in the Constitution are "so help me God," and as you all know, all presidents say that because Washington said those words. That's the reason they say it. The president is inaugurated, he takes his oath on a Bible. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say he should take his oath on a Bible. Washington did. And the Bible he chose, remember he was extremely popular, the most popular man in America. If he had chosen a church's Bible, there would be 2 problems. That church would have bragging rights through the roof, and the other churches would be angry. Why did you choose them and not us? What he did was he went to St. John's Lodge number 1 in New York and used their Masonic Bible, which, by the way, was printed in 1767. It's still in use by St. John's Lodge number 1. Every Grand Master of New York has been sworn in on that Bible, as well as a number of presidents. If somebody elected to be president wishes to be sworn in on that Bible, it is taken from New York by armored car, only by St. John's Lodge number 1. Only members of that lodge are able to be around that Bible. No other person. It's delivered, it's placed where it should be, the oath of office is administered, and then it's brought back to New York the same way. The last president to use it was President George H.W. Bush, because he felt that he was becoming president on the 200th anniversary of Washington. A number of other presidents wanted to, but there was inclement weather during their inauguration. So you're not allowed to touch it with your hands. Not because of any reason other than it was printed in 1767. We have oils on our hands. If you see the pictures of President George H.W. Bush being inaugurated, his hands are in gloves and they're over the Bible. They're not on the Bible. Because again, we have to protect that book because of its age. There have been other Masonic presidents. Besides Washington, you have President Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Buchanan, President Andrew Johnson, McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, President Taft, Harding, FDR, Truman, and the last Masonic president was President Gerald Ford. Of this list, President Truman and Andrew Jackson share a very interesting trait. They were not only Masons and presidents, they were Grand Masters of their respective jurisdictions. President Andrew Jackson was the Grand Master of Tennessee from 1822 to 1824, and President Truman was Grand Master of Missouri in 1941. They're the only 2 presidents who were also Grand Masters. Now, there is a certain aspect of Masonry, what we call Prince Hall Masonry. In the 1770s, a number of people of African descent, men of African descent, petitioned St. John's Lodge in Massachusetts to become Masons. When you become a Mason, the lodge votes on you, whether to accept you. It's a secret ballot. You get white balls and black balls that you choose. Ever hear the term being blackballed? You now know where this term comes from. In the lodge, you choose and you vote It's totally secret. Nobody ever has to know how you voted on the candidate. All you need is one black ball, and that's it. It's over. And there was a black ball, a couple of them. Okay, America was a different country, so these men joined an Irish military lodge. Then in 1784, Prince Hall, the leader, went to England and got a charter from the Grand Lodge of England, the Premier Grand Lodge of England, to form an African Lodge. African Lodge number 499. But the charter specifically stated that it was only for one lodge, period. And they stressed that. Prince Hall was an amazing man in many ways. He was a leader in education, especially for former slaves. He was a leader in many different aspects to help improve people, giving former slaves the ability to actually work and get a skill so that they could actually earn a living. What was also very energetic. He began forming more lodges, and a Grand Lodge, and more Grand Lodges. And England sent him a letter saying, "We only gave you a charter for one lodge." And he wrote back, "Really?" And this went back and forth. Remember, this is the late 18th century, early 19th century. Communications were very slow. He was in Massachusetts, they were in England, and he was relying on the fact that communications were not that good. And then in the 1840s, the Prince Hall, what we can now call Prince Hall Lodges, broke with England. African Lodge number 499 became African Lodge number 1. And then they went on from there. So in America, you did have this system set up. But it doesn't, and they were not recognized by regular Grand Lodges, officially. Unofficially, they were Brother Masons. Remember that Masons are all brothers. So they did do work together. Two important things came out of the Prince Hall Lodges. One was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME churches. It was founded by two Prince Hall Masons, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. At one point in the AME church, if you wanted to be a deacon in that church, you had to be a Prince Hall Mason first. The other thing that affected American history was the Underground Railroad. Anybody who really studies the Underground Railroad and is a Mason will recognize the signs, the passwords, the handshakes of how they recognize each other. That was Prince Hall Masons. They were the ones who organized the Underground Railroad. Now, when the Underground Railroad got north, remember they had to get over the hump to get people to Canada. They ran into a big problem. The North was lily white. These people stood out for an obvious reason. That's when the regular lodges took over and got them across to Canada. So even though they didn't recognize each other, they did work together. They said, what you're doing is important, we want to be part of that. And so it shows you there was a certain camaraderie. Now this whole issue of recognition with the Grand Lodges, no Grand Lodge is over another Grand Lodge. Something very important to remember. All Grand Lodges are equal, but they have to follow certain rules. If you don't follow these rules, they will withdraw recognition. Two important events in history illustrate this. The Grand Orient of France, which was the first Grand Lodge of France, in the 1870s, decided to take the Bible off the altar. In every Masonic lodge, you will have a Bible, a Tanakh or a Jewish Bible, a Quran, a Bhagavad Gita, a holy book on the altar in the lodge. You can't open without it. The Grand Orient of France said, no, we're going to put the Declarations of the Rights of Man there. We'll accept atheists. That is a major no-no. And they got involved in politics. in France. The Grand Lodge of England said, if you do this, we withdraw recognition. The French, being the French, said, we don't care. And the Grand Lodge of England withdrew recognition. And then recognized, because in France they organized a new Grand Lodge, the regular Grand Lodge of France, and they got recognized. So but that shows you there's a certain rules that you cannot violate. Otherwise, the whole system would break down. Now, what happened was in 1897 in Peru, the Grand Master of Peru decided to take the Bible off the altar in Peru. Upon hearing about this, the Grand Master of New York wrote a letter, an open letter. And it starts off, the Grand Lodge of Peru has committed suicide. So you know he was not exactly in agreement with this. And from this letter, we get actually a part of our ritual in the Grand Lodge of New York, a unique statement about religion in Masonry. It's during the first degree that we give, and in the degree there's a lot of ritual, which I really can't go into because a lot of it is secret. But this part I can repeat. I've checked with the authorities in New York what I can and cannot say, and they said this part can actually be said even for non-Masons. And this is a speech based on that letter. After getting the degree, the candidates are standing around, and Master says, I particularly direct your attention to the great light of Masonry, the Holy Bible. Howsoever men differ in creed and theology, all good men are agreed that within the covers of the Holy Bible are found those principles of morality which lay the foundations to build a righteous life. Freemasonry, therefore, opens this book upon its altars with the command to each of its votaries that he diligently study therein to learn the ways of everlasting life, adopting no particular creed, forbidding sectarian discussion within the lodge rooms, encouraging each to be steadfast in the faith of his choosing. Freemasonry takes all good men by the hand, leading them to its altars, points to the open Bible thereon, and urges upon each that he faithfully direct his steps through life by the light he there shall find, and as he there shall find it. If from our sacred altars, the atheist, the infidel, the irreligious man, or the libertine should be able to wrest this book of sacred law and thus remove or even obscure the greatest light in Masonry, that light that has been the rule and guide of Masonry, then could we no longer claim for ourselves the great rank and title of free and accepted Masons. But so long as that sacred light shines upon our altars, so long as it illuminates the pathway of the craftsman by its golden rays of truth, so long and no longer can Freemasonry live and shed its beneficent influence upon mankind. Guard then this book of sacred and immutable laws as you would guard your very life. Defend it as you would the flag of your country. Live according to its divine teachings, with the everlasting assurances of a blessed immortality. Okay, that's the Masonic idea of religion. Again, you notice no religion is favored, but it's understood there are certain things that are basic to morality. One is a Bible, a Quran, a Jewish Bible. You have to have that basis. And that's basically the Masonic. Now, to become a Mason, how does one become a Mason, you might ask? It's very simple. You have to be a man. Sorry, ladies. You have to be free. You cannot be a slave. A slave has no free choice by definition. And remember, in the 18th century, slavery was legal in every country on the face of the earth. So it's not just an idle thought. You have to be of legal age, which in New York State is 18. You have to believe in deity and believe in the immortality of the soul. And you have to be recommended. You cannot go and say, I want to be a Mason. Someone has to recommend you. You have to have a mentor or sponsor. Then, after the lodge votes on you, you go through the first and second and third degrees. Now there are concordant bodies in Masonry, what we call the Scottish Rite, the York Rite. I don't have time to get into them. But the most interesting part of Masonry that I think most people do know are the Shriners, right? Everybody knows about the Shriners, their hospitals, and the crazy things they do. How they came about was a group of Masons who would meet for lunch at the Knickerbocker Club in Manhattan. They would meet there every day. They agreed they enjoyed being Masons. They liked the brothers. They liked everything except business meetings. They were boring. You know, can you imagine a business meeting being boring? So they really wanted to do something about it. They decided they'd form an organization, a Masonic organization, where the meetings would be fun. And so they organized the ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. Arabic culture was all the rage in New York at the time, so they just took on this whole idea. And they soon became known, and they spread very rapidly. By the end of the 1870s, there were shrines popping up in every city in America. And they were really the playground of Masons. They were the clowns. They began doing really wild things. But they kept things within bounds. And the other thing is, every Masonic organization needs a charity. They chose children's hospitals. Then in 1920, they decided to build their own hospitals for children suffering from burns and other issues like muscle development, etc. There are 22 of these hospitals throughout the United States, one in Canada and Mexico. They're open to any child who needs them, regardless of race, color, creed. Remember, by the way, these rules were set up in the 1920s, so they were way ahead of the curve on this one. They're free to the children and their families, and they do not take government money, because when you take government money, you get bureaucrats who will tell you how to take care of the child. They're trying to say, no, it's the doctor who dictates this, not some bureaucrat in some office. So they refuse government money. They also, by the way, refuse insurance. There's a guy who came up to me, he said, I took my kid to the hospital in Boston, took out my insurance card, and they said, put it away. We don't want to see it. They raised the money themselves. The Shriners raised between $1 to $3 million a day. Wow. So it gives you an idea of, what they're, and so all the crazy things they do has to do with these hospitals. They will raise the money. And they also sometimes do it in their own unique way. I once attended a shrine meeting in Kismet in Long Island. There were about 60 or 70 guys there. An extremely rich fellow who's a Shriner walked in and announced to the Shrine Temple, gentlemen, I will donate $1,000 to the hospital for every man who shaves his head here tonight. $40,000 was raised. Because the guy said, okay, for the hospital, no problem. But it tells you something about these men. That, yes, they're having a good time, but it's a good time with a purpose. Today, Masonry is around the world. By the way, with Prince Hall, there are still Prince Hall Grand Lodges. We do not get together. They don't come and are absorbed for a number of different reasons. Number one, they have their own history, etc. It's also they have their money, we have our money, and things get complicated. And in issues of recognition, the problem is not race, okay? There are many good Masons in the regular Grand Lodge of New York and throughout the United States who happen to be men of color. And one of the bodies I'm in, I am in the minority, and I'm going to be the head of that body in about a half a year, or even less. My wife is really thrilled about that one. And I am one of the few white men in the lot, in the chapter. But, you know, race is not an issue. The problem is Prince Hall lodges are afraid of disappearing. There's no reason for them to exist if, okay, sort of like if you remember the Negro Leagues in baseball, before Jackie Robinson crossed the color line, and then the Negro Leagues disappeared, there was no need for them. So Prince Hall Lodge is afraid of that. So I, as a Mason in New York, can join a lodge, and I have joined a lodge in Australia, in Israel, and other places. There's no problem. As long as that lodge is in a jurisdiction recognized by New York, I can join. A Prince Hall Lodge member in New York cannot join a lodge outside of Prince Hall in New York. That shows you how much they're afraid of losing members, which, you know, we're not going to debate it. I think Prince Hall Masons, by the way, do a great job in their ritual, much better than we do. And when we do a better job in education, so we do have a thing where they come for education, we go to see how ritual's done, and we all get along. And by the way, Prince Hall Lodges will accept white people. So it's sort of funny, race is not an issue. It's just the way it developed, and that's it. Anyways, I've been signaled that I'm over time. Are there any questions? Or are there any answers?
Yeah.
Yes, back there.
Besides business meetings, what are the meetings seeking to accomplish?
One is charity. All Masonic lodges and Grand Lodges, etc., have a charity. And then also, we ask if there's anybody who knows of somebody who needs help. And we will, by the way, someone might go to the master and say quietly, so-and-so needs help, but they don't want it to be known. And, you know, so in other words, we discuss things like that, fundraising for these things, where we're going to eat. If we're not going to eat, you know, we're going to have collation. That's a very important thing. Remember, we're men. We like to eat and drink, as many people here know.
What education?
And education. A lot of lodges have set aside money for helping pay college tuitions, etc.
I mean, your education, lectures.
Oh, well, no, lecturers, we do this for free.
No, I mean, yes, what's in a meeting?
Oh, and then there's also lectures. We go into different aspects of Masonry, and different things that we can learn and pull out, and then my wife was reminding me that lectures, and I said, yeah, I do lectures. No, she said, your lectures in lodge. I do give a lot of lectures in lodge. But, you know, these things are discussed. Every lodge will have to have a lecture, because we're trying to make ourselves better men. And therefore and then there's debates, etc., back and forth. What did the speaker say? What did he mean? Did he mean this? Did he mean that? But it's always done within a comfortable place, because in the final analysis, we are brothers. And we always remember that. Any other questions?
Yes, 459 should be 459 as opposed to 499 in Massachusetts. Or Prince Hall.
Prince Hall?
That's 459.
459. Okay, I stand corrected. Okay. He, by the way, is a Prince Hall Mason, so. And he and I have spoken before, and I stand corrected by you. Okay, any other questions? Is there a lady here who raised her hand?
The lodge on 23rd Street in New York.
Right.
Is that the Grand Lodge?
That's the Grand Lodge of the state of New York.
And does the masonry own that building?
The Masons own that building. And by the way, I'm an official tour guide of that building. And I'll be happy to give you my card afterwards if you want to tour the Grand Lodge of New York. Get in touch with me and we'll arrange it. And in New York, all lodges in Manhattan meet in that building because if you know anything about Manhattan, prices of property is through the roof. Lodges cannot afford to have their own buildings. In most places in the world, you have your own building. But Manhattan, because of the economic situation, there are 80 lodges that meet in that building. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the importance of an individual's spirituality or belief in a specific religion. Does that include non-monotheistic religions?
There's a whole debate about that one. But basically, if we ask a man, do you believe in deity and the immortality of the soul? If he says yes, we don't go beyond that. We trust him at his word. Yes?
So, given the 21st century and your belief in doing good for charity, I'm just wondering why, or are you debating the admittance of women now?
That's
Making it more universal.
okay. That's a debate that's gone on for a long time, believe it or not.
Is there some philosophical basis that you're struggling?
The real problem, and this is something that we have to always remember. There are some issues that a man will talk to another man about that he will be uncomfortable talking about it with a woman present. And there are certain issues that might come up. Or say a husband's having problems in his marriage. He doesn't want to talk to a woman, but he wants advice from an older brother who's been there. So in other words, it goes back and forth. Right now, the consensus is no.
But there is an organization closely aligned.
Right. There is something called the Order of the Eastern Star, which is sort of a sisterhood tied to Masonry. And many good women are in there because they see their husbands going to lodge and having a good time, meeting good men, and they want to have something similar. So, we don't, and by the way, when you also, before you become a member of a lodge, we actually invite the wife to come to the initial interview. She should know what the husband's getting involved with. And it's not going to be a surprise. Our slogan is family first. If you can't come to lodge because of a problem with your wife or whatever, it's okay. We understand. Any other questions? Yes, lady back there.
How did it get started? Like in legal law, they said you couldn't be a Catholic and be a Mason.
Right. The popes had their own reasons.
So it's still true.
It's still true, but I can't comment on the Catholic faith. I'm not a Catholic. I'll let Catholics, but I do know many good Catholics, by the way, who are Masons, and I ask them how they justify it. He says, I don't tell the priest.
Okay.
Okay, it's not my, yes,
Oh, I was going to address her question
yeah,
and say that the Second Vatican, okay, which I think was Pope John the 23rd, I think the Grand Lodge of England, which is the Grand Lodge over all the Masonry, I think they had a congregation of people that went and met with the Vatican and convinced them that Masons were not, it wasn't a religion, they didn't adopt or support any one specific religion, and there was kind of a meeting.
a sort of a meeting of the mind.
A meeting of the minds.
Yeah, so what he said, for those who didn't hear him, was during Vatican II, there was a discussion between the Grand Lodge of England, which is what we call the Mother Grand Lodge. They're not the lodge over all Masons, but they're respected above others. And they met with the Pope and they came to an accommodation.
But now it's not like it.
Listen, I cannot comment about the current state of the church, etc. I'm not in it.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to pretend. Any other questions? And still no answers. Okay, thank you very much. And don't forget to thank the people who are in charge of these lectures and all that for giving me the opportunity to present it.
Thank you.
I have a question for you too. I will be in the